everything possible, better said, to keep our environment and the people of California safe. And so just as we have in recent years post San Bruno, as Senator Hill is all too familiar with, our job is not only to make sure that the programs and the strategies meet the challenge of oversight for purposes of safety, but that the Public Utilities Commission itself is doing its job of overseeing railroad companies and others to ensure the safe movement of trains in California, and that includes but is not limited to assessing the quality and integrity of our rail infrastructure. So before I call our first witnesses, let me turn to Senator Fuller for any opening remarks.
Thank you. I just really appreciate this hearing today. Obviously, Bakersfield to Needles and Barstow are all in my area. We have a lot of rail lines and a lot of things that we want to be sure are safe. And I think that it's a good time for us all to review the safety. So thank you to the chair.
Senator Hill, Senator Wilk, any opening comments?
Yes, I would like to say something. I, along with Senator Fuller, I live on the Capitol Corridor line, and there is an extraordinary increase being proposed in the traffic, and I think the safety issues and our oversight are extremely important, so I'm really looking forward to this hearing today. The line passes through West Sacramento, Davis, Dixon, Fairfield, Sassoon, as most railroads do, right through the heart of the cities now. Cities grew up around them. And the permit that Valero is seeking, as we speak, is to expand that traffic. So safety is an important issue to my community. Thank you for this hearing.
Thank you very much. And I think Senator Wilk acknowledges, makes a significant observation here. It's not just the significant increase in volume that we've seen in the last 4 years, but looking at what's been proposed, not just what's been planned, we can see a significant growth from here forward as well. So no time like the present to get a brief and an overview and ask questions about what we're doing and whether or not it's sufficient. In our third panel, we will hear from representatives of the different railroad companies. Our second panel will consist of presentations from the Public Utilities Commission as well as the California Department of Transportation. There will be an opportunity for public comment at the end of our hearing, but to get us started, let me invite forward Bree Lindsay, who is a fellow from the California Council on Science and Technology in the Senate Office of Research to provide our overview. Dr. Lindsay, welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
Just press that red button in front of you, make sure that microphone's on. Okay, there you go.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you.
A little bit closer, sorry. That's all right. There we go.
Okay. Now, good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Bree Lindsay, like you said, a science fellow working with the Senate Office of Research, just here to provide a little bit of background on the issue today. So the overview is just that the oil boom from the Bakken region in North Dakota and Montana has increased the amount of crude oil being shipped in the United States. And while crude is typically transferred by pipeline, especially to inland refineries, and tanker to coastal refineries, rail offers a more flexible transport method from regions not well served by existing pipelines, and therefore crude shipment by rail is increasing. Nationwide, we've seen an increase from about 9,500 tank cars of crude in 2008 to an estimated 400,000 tank cars of crude in 2013, which is an increase of 42 times in only 5 years. California doesn't have the option to import by pipeline because no crude rail pipelines originating outside of California connect the state. So we are seeing, the state is also seeing a large increase of crude transported by rail. as Senator Padilla already said, we are seeing from 2009 to 2013 a 135-fold increase in rail transport of crude. And the governor's budget projects that the state will see a significant rise in the amount of crude oil being imported by rail from about 3 million barrels a year to about 150 million barrels a year by 2016. This number represents about 25% of the total crude that's refined in California. And the figure comes from the planning of several crude by rail projects that were estimated to come online by 2016. These projects are going to be located throughout the state, specifically in Benicia, Wilmington, Pittsburgh, and San Luis Obispo County, and 2 in Bakersfield. These projects represent a maximum rail receipt capacity of about 159 million barrels a year. And that translates to somewhere around 230,000 rail cars a year. The 2 major railroads that are going to be bringing this crude oil into California are Union Pacific and BNSF, and you can see in the maps in your guys' packets, and also right here, the yellow lines represent the tracks owned by Union Pacific, which is about a little over 3,200 miles, and BNSF in green operates a little over 2,000 miles of track. The remaining lines, the gray lines, are short lines that are split between 23 other railroads and make up about 1,450 miles. So SOR was also requested to summarize recent railroad accidents. According to the Association of American Railroads, of all hazardous materials transported by train, more than 99.99% make it to their destination without spills or leaks due to accident. But the recent spate of crude-bearing train accidents has caused some to be concerned about shipping Bakken crude by train. One of the worst and most visible examples of this happened in July in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, when a 74-car train derailed and tank cars carrying crude exploded, resulting in 47 deaths, the leveling of the downtown area, a leaking of tens of thousands of gallons of oil into the river. This high-profile accident was followed by several others in rapid succession. In October, when 13 cars derailed and 4 cars carrying crude caught fire in Edmonton, Alberta. In November, in Aliceville, Alabama, when a 90-car train carrying crude from North Dakota lost 30 cars and about a dozen of those burned. Then again in December, in Castleton, North Dakota, when a 106-car train collided with a grain train that had derailed earlier, and about 20 cars left the tracks, 18 carrying crude exploded and burned. Then again in early January, in Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, when a mixed train carrying crude, propane, and other materials derailed, 17 cars were thrown from the tracks, 5 cars carrying crude exploded. Late January in Pennsylvania, when a 101-car train lost cars off the tracks on a bridge over the Schuylkill River. There was no, I had to ask how to pronounce that. There were no spills in that accident, but it was some spectacular photos. And then the most recent of these was in mid-February in Vandergrift, Pennsylvania, when a 120-car train had 4 crude rails spill 3,000 to 4,000 gallons of oil. And except for the Lac-Mégantic tragedy, none of these had casualties reported. But I'm happy to see everybody looking into it. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. And we do imagine have a couple of questions before we move on to the next panel. The first batch would be sort of to help put these numbers and projections of what's happening in California in context. Are we alone in the list of states seeing a significant increase in the transport of crude? And if not, at least sort of to this level of increase in volume? Can you comment on that?
We are not alone in seeing an increase in crude, but I don't have numbers to back up. With the amount of refining going on in California, I would not be surprised to see us having a very large increase, but I don't have numbers to back that up.
Okay. And your reports about recent incidents seems to be sort of a mixed news, if you will. You know, for every incident, whether or not injuries resulted or evacuations, you know, so the fact that there's more incidents is one thing, but the fact that it is, you know, without disastrous, horrific consequence, at least at this stage, I think is a good news and may point towards maybe some of the existing or past protocols having their net benefit and their net help. But what existed under one context of volume may or may not apply to the future, and that's, I think, what we're doing here today. Senator Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the report and the information. It's kind of interesting because some of the questions that I'm looking at is the impact of these 100-car trains and these very large trains of crude that are coming through rail corridors that haven't seen that type of or that length of train previously. And the issue we're talking about is crude specifically, but do you see the same impact on other chemicals that may be hazardous liquids that may be transported through there? Is there a similar concern with that or of more? So, and then I've got a couple of other ones.
Well, I can say for reference that the numbers for import of things like ethanol, California is importing something around 40,000 tank cars of ethanol a year right now, which is less than the projected number of tank cars that of crude. But I don't have other information about how that's changing. I don't think the change is as big, but.
Do you have a thought on, now these trains, my understanding is they're becoming more compact a little bit, which I would think would kind of increase the per square footage of weight and how that would impact some of the bridges that we're going over with these trains today. Is that,
so
you notice something with that?
Yeah, currently the crude by rail it's coming in is coming on manifest trains, so it's mixed mixed materials on trains. But if you have a unit train with just tanker after tanker of the same material, I think some have expressed, and others who are going to follow me will be able to answer this much more clearly, but some have expressed concern that the very heavy tank cars, which have wheels just at the ends, are going to have concentrated weight loads in certain places. So I think that people following me will be able to speak a little bit more intelligently on that, more background.
And one final thought, the crude that's coming from Bakken shale oil, is that more corrosive than other oils that we've seen?
Yeah, so it is more corrosive and has also been found to be more flammable than people expected. In fact, there have been a number of notices of probable violation handed out by PHMSA that show that sometimes these shipments are mislabeled as not as dangerous as they actually are. And samples have been taken of the crude that's in some of these tank trains, and they've found that laboratory results have shown that the flash point is lower than expected, and just the general volatility of the crude is more than expected. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Fuller.
In looking at your chart of the accidents on page 5, I was unable to tell if any of them were really in California. It looks like a lot of them are Canada.
No, the accidents that are in the background material are not California, unless you're referring to the appendix, which has additional things that I didn't bring up in this presentation.
Okay. So even though there's been a huge increase in the last year, maybe 2 years, in accidents in general and in the supply, in California, there really hasn't been any increase in accidents. Is that correct?
As related to crude by rail, I would say that's correct.
Okay. So today, maybe the emphasis we're looking for is just being sure we understand what we're doing correctly in California and what's working better than some of these other places, and making sure we keep our focus on those services as well as trying to pinpoint if there's anything that they're not doing in Canada that we are not doing and that we need to improve on. Would that be a correct analysis?
I think that the speakers following me will have a lot to say about that, and that Senator Hill brought up a good point that the nature of the transport may be changing. And so this hearing seems like a very good opportunity to see how that change is going to be handled. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people that have a lot to say about that after me.
Great, thank you. That's a very interesting chart for us to see. Thank you.
Senator Wilk.
Just a brief question. I'm concerned not only about the nature and the frequency of the crude transport, but I want to know about the rail cars. Do you have any sense about their ability or whether they are equipped to carry the kinds of fuel, the different kinds of fuel that we're talking about? Mm-hmm. That this fuel is somehow different from or behaves differently than chlorine, ethanol, and the other things that are toxic and are in fact can be safely transported.
Mm-hmm. I think that might be best answered by people coming after me. I wouldn't want to misinform anybody.
That's fine. I will ask it then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. I have another sort of batch of questions, and it's sort of why we're here today is because of this projected increase, not just, again, recent years, but going forward, projected increase in the volume of crude being transported by rail in California. And I think it's the Energy Commission or the Governor's Office that pegs it at about a 25% increase?
I think the Governor's budget has a 25% based on Energy Commission projections.
Right. So my question is really about methodology, how precise you think that 25% might be, or do we have a margin of error of 10, 15%, in either direction?
I don't have a margin of error, but I think it is important to note that that percentage it represents a proportion of the total that's being refined, that's being brought in by rail, and that number depends on how many of these pending projects come online and how close to their maximum capacity they're able to operate. And not only whether these come online, but how soon. So many of them are still in the permitting and planning stage. And for instance, I think it was the Benicia one has even had the draft EIR pushed back to March. So it's been a little longer in coming online than people originally projected.
Well, we all know how easy it is to permit and cite things in California. So I would assume most of these are going to stay on time and on budget.
Yes.
And not to distract us from the focus of the hearing, but if, I assume this increase in volume of crude is there because the market forces are there. And if that volume does not come into California by way of rail, what are the infrastructure options for moving that crude?
Well, there is Bakken rail coming in. Bakken crude coming in by rail already, as we said before, on the manifest trains. So there is some coming in already. If these don't come online, there may be other crude by rail projects coming online in different states. For instance, Tesoro has a facility that they're planning in Vancouver, Washington, and if that's successful, then that would be to unload some of this onto marine vessels and come down to other West Coast refineries. So we wouldn't miss out on all the Bakken crude.
Right, so it's just a matter of how the crude will get from where it's coming to refineries in California, not if
as
it's
I
not
understand
in by rail, then it'll go elsewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
But other people will be able to add information on
Okay,
that.
so keep that in mind. Any final questions for Dr. Lindsay? No, seeing none. Thank you for
Thank you so much.
teeing it up for us. Let me invite forward our next panel. Mr. Paul King, Deputy Director, Office of Rail Safety and Enforcement Division, from the CPUC, along with Dolores Valls, professional engineer from the State Bridge Maintenance Engineering at California Department of Transportation. As they come forward, let me just announce that we've asked them to come forward and outline, what's well within the state's jurisdiction to be able to act on this issue versus what lies in federal jurisdiction. So we want to know what we're in control of, what we're not in control of, and what context we're working in. So, Dr. King, I'll let you go first, and also announce if I have to duck out in the middle of one of your presentations, please don't take it personally. This hearing got started a little bit later than we expected due to a session going longer than expected. But I'll be handing the gavel over to Senator Hill when it comes time for me to excuse myself. Thank you. Press it one more time and bring it a little bit closer to your mouth. There you go.
I'm Paul King, Deputy Director for the Office of Rail Safety. That has 3 rail safety programs, railroads, which is the one we'll be talking about here, but also rail transit like BART and the Sacramento Regional Rail, and then rail crossings in the state. And just so I make sure I remember to say it, we share this jurisdiction and the enforcement of federal regulations with federal railroad inspectors. I'm going to be talking mostly about us, but I just want to make sure that you know I'm not ignoring them. So we appreciate this opportunity. One of the nice things about being able to come and talk in forums such as these and what's going on right now is we're seeing personally I'm seeing some breaking down of silos and some good communication between different state agencies, and I think it's very helpful. There's a wealth of information that's coming at us very quickly. Information changes. The projections, as you know, in a couple areas have changed. Just referring to a couple, we know that the Bakersfield, I believe it's called Plains American facility out near Buttonwillow, that one is under construction, so it's a little faster than some of the projections, whereas the Benicia one, we have understood from the railroads, is still falling down a bit. And basically our view of this is pretty much an unanticipated but unacceptable risk that's posed to California, given the projections and given the consequences of an event should it happen. I wanted to commend Bree. She must be a UC Berkeley graduate, for a good report that saved me a lot of words. I read it and I appreciated it greatly. I thought it was very thorough and very nicely documented. I just want to make a couple notes here very quickly about the report. I believe you have copies of her report. On page 10, in the second paragraph, it mentions regarding the Dunsmuir spill in 1991 that poisoned the river. I'm sure you all remember that. Killed everything in the river for 30-some miles, 30, 40 miles. The statement here that the PUC imposed restrictions on length and weight of trains, on the configuration of trains, and prohibited the use of a siding. The PUC did that. That's absolutely correct. But there's a later statement in the document that you need to pair with this, and much of what we did ended up being preempted through a court trial. Those were the railroad's rules that we had adopted, that they had upped after the accident. They had improved, and we had adopted their rules as regulations, which requires approval to change. That was the problem that I'll talk about later. Another note down at the bottom of that page, positive train control. Last, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, time flies here, I can't remember which, I rode the inaugural run of the Metrolinx train with positive train control. It was a very nice demonstration. Senator Feinstein was a keynote speaker and was also on that train. And I mention that for 2 reasons. One, to acknowledge BNSF, because that was on a BNSF line. This is something that BNSF had worked through with them. Both Union Pacific and BNSF have been working and are probably going to beat the deadlines for the rest of the country quite handily. And then just one final note. There's a figure on page 13, about the third paragraph, where it says more than 12,000 miles of track were inspected. I have to apologize for that figure. I'm afraid this is an example of using federal data to look at a California mandate, and we may have apples and oranges and double counts. That's too high. It could be a double count when you run the geometry car at 79 miles per hour with automated inspection. If you get a few runs of that, it can really jack the miles up. But it doesn't mean that that's a comprehensive set. It could be duplicative. So I need to get back to folks on that one. So just an overview. I want to run through the accidents very quickly. And just make a note on what I have seen nationally, and you've also probably seen in the press, but there's quite a public concern about these, and we acknowledge that and agree. Then I want to, since what the California legislature might end up doing, what the PUC might end up doing, does involve the jurisdictional boundaries between the federal government and the state. I'll walk through an analysis which I painfully spent many years in litigation after Dunsmuir. And then I want to discuss our oversight program. Again, acknowledge the FRA State Safety Participation Program. Then talk about some of our rules, and then what I envision might be needed to address and be up to the task on this projected increase of crude oil. So just going to the pictures, you've seen those. I think an interesting note on the Lac-Mégantic accident is you can make stronger tank cars only so much, but an accident of that magnitude may have decreased the tragedy somewhat, but they were at 63 miles per hour when they derailed in the town. A couple of the other accidents, the Ellisville, Alabama, was on a trestle. I don't know if that was involved, if the trestle itself was involved. The Castleton derailment, one point on all these is there needs to be analysis of what the speeds of these trains are. The AAR just had an agreement to drop the speeds of its trains in populated areas from 50 to 40. That's breaking news. And I can double check that, but I think most of these trains were actually already traveling about that speed. The Castleton one, I was right about that. Then ethanol has been, while not as frequent, I mean, this is a 6-year period as opposed to about a 6-month period for crude oil. The ethanol accidents have been just as much impact as far as the explosions that occur. Unfortunately, most railroad trackage is out in rural areas, so they're not getting the casualties that you might have in populated areas, of course. Yep. So just discussing federal jurisdiction over railroad safety, it's been going on for a long time. I mean, railroads pretty much started running in this country just before the Civil War. Long about the turn of the previous century, it was clear that safety requirements need to be developed. One of the most important one was to develop air brakes, an air brake system where all the cars are linked together with a common air hose to keep from having brakemen run along the top of the train setting handbrakes in all kinds of weather and all time and day. There was a high fatality rate. Also automatic couplers, so brakemen didn't have to reach in and drop a pin between cars that were moving together. Automatic couplers were required so the cars can couple without anybody being in between them. But what this ended up causing is that in order for cars to travel across the country, they had to be interoperable between different states. So the feds had to take over this jurisdiction and prevent the states from having different requirements at every state line. The railroads will if they don't say it, I'll beat them to it, but they decry a patchwork of regulatory requirements. And for good reason in this case here. Boiler Inspection Act is a similar thing. You don't want a locomotive to have different requirements as it crosses the state line. So it's federally, the states are federally preempted. In 1970, the purpose of the Rail Safety Act of 1970 was to enhance safety. It was a bad time for rail safety in this country. The purpose was to make it nationally uniform to the extent practicable. So there were two fundamental prongs to the states being able to or being preempted from regulating. One, if the FRA has covered the subject matter, the states cannot regulate. Second prong is the exception to that, and that is if it's a local safety hazard, if it doesn't burden interstate commerce, and if it's no conflict with federal law. Unfortunately, my opinion, and I believe history has borne out, there has never been a local safety hazard site identified, including the Cantera Loop, which, if there was any, that should be one. To develop any regulations, I think the fundamental view is subject matter coverage, and that's why I have the next page here. Here's a fairly comprehensive list. It's not all, but these are the ones that are probably the most important as far as we're concerned. Let me just call out a few. The railroad safety enforcement procedures and rules of practice dictate how our state inspectors will enforce the federal regulations, including fines and burden of proof and so forth, documentation. Part 212, that's what sets up the agreements that the states have for having inspectors, certification, qualifications. Then, of course, track safety standards, freight car standards, locomotive standards. Just running quickly down some of the more important ones. And brake system safety standards for freight, Part 232. As you can imagine, to have interchangeable equipment across the country, there needs to be uniformity there. So we also enforce regulations that come under the purview of the of PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and those have to do with shipping papers and requirements for seals and sealing tank cars when they are loaded and offered into shipment. You don't want anything flammable to leak, because then you could end up with a fire and ultimately you could end up with a breach. And when they derail, if the fittings are loose here, it's very problematic as well. So let me move to the state jurisdiction. As many of you know, PUC was considered its beginning in 1911 during the Hiram Johnson reforms. And we've been granted broad authority, and you can see these sections I write here, Section 309.7, particularly Section 768 says the PUC can do anything it needs to regarding safety. Well, of course, that's all cast in the context of the Federal Railroad Administration, what they have done as well. Just a couple here. Section 765 dictates mandates to staff for inspections, the safety activities that the PUC needs to conduct, and it also requires the PUC to be in the state participation program and to provide a report to the legislature. Section 7711 was promulgated, adopted after Dunsmuir, to look and see, okay, if we have this accident in Dunsmuir, are there other places in the state that may have the same risk? It required this PUC to do a risk assessment of the entire state, not in the sense of a comprehensive risk assessment like we would be talking about with SMS, but focusing on the kinds of things that happened at Dunsmuir, which had to do with the movement of trains, train makeup, the weight of trains, and the interaction of cars that could cause them basically to be pulled to the inside of a curve if they're too heavy, or to be pushed out coming downhill if they're too heavy. Section 7712 required the PUC to adopt regulations based on those local safety hazard determinations. The PUC was successful in identifying local safety hazards if you don't capitalize local safety hazards. Statistically sound, we showed that with a high degree of predictability, you could point to where accidents are likely to happen on these routes into the state. It holds up for today. The research we did in the 90s predicts where accidents happen now with a reasonable, not entirely of course, but with a reasonable degree of statistical significance. However, if you capitalize local safety hazard, then that takes on the federal meaning, and in the federal meaning, a lot of other things come into play, and it's mostly been defined by court precedent. So there's a lot of court precedents out there that will tell you that, in fact, now it seems as though what prevented California from adopting those regulations under the local safety hazard exception was whether or not a national regulation could be crafted to encompass the hazard, which is a different criterion. And it's my view that you could craft a regulation nationally that would cover something even if it was the only one. But then moving on our general orders, we've had general orders in effect. I'll just cite what I think is probably the three most important or relevant. General Order 26D provides for safe clearances alongside tracks and alongside rolling equipment. And California, that was about 1911, 1912, that was adopted. California has not had the kinds of crushing fatalities that trainmen have experienced, switchmen have experienced, that other states have that have not had a clearance requirement like this. General Order 118A sets standards for walkways. As you can imagine, walking all kinds of weather alongside a train, having to work around moving boxcars and so forth, you want to prevent any slips, trips, or falls, which could, of course, be into the equipment and be disastrous. The kind of material, we just recently enhanced the general order to include the kind of material. You don't want large rocks that you can't walk on. You need to have a reasonably walkable surface. And then General Order 161 extended, just hitting the highlights, extended some of the federal hazardous material rules to private tracks. The FRA does not have jurisdiction or has not exercised jurisdiction on private tracks. So, for example, this general order extended the track standards to industry tracks where hazardous materials are shipped. It also required things like static electricity grounding for unloading facilities. Just to recap the decision after Dunsmuir and give you a list, I think I have all of the regulations listed here. We were preempted, the courts determined we were preempted for trying to require use of dynamic brakes in a minimum number of dynamic brakes. We were, and a dynamic brake is the locomotive braking device, much like a hybrid car. It's an electric regeneration from the electric traction motors. And it's a very effective brake. End-of-train devices, that's a telemetry device on the other end of the train. If the train line were to get blocked and you can't initiate a brake application from the head end of the train, you radio a signal back to the rear end of the train and you can initiate a brake activation back there. That would have prevented at least a couple accidents in California in the 80s and 90s. We were preempted from a track standards regulation. That was one we tried to put under the local safety hazard exemption for Cantera Loop, and it just didn't fly. And then training. The FRA has a part for training. It covers training according to the court sufficiently that the state can't regulate. We were successful in requiring track defect detectors. Those are detectors that, to be located in certain spacing, those are detectors that will pick up whether a bearing is failing. There are other wheel detectors to detect a wheel with a flat spot or a broken wheel that'll be pounding along the rail. And then finally, to go directly to what happened at Dunsmuir, we did end up with a settlement. The Ninth Circuit remanded the court's, the district court's findings, remanded it back to the district court to revisit the train makeup regulations, and we, both the PUC and the railroads, decided to settle on that. And what we do have now is what I call process standards. The railroads are required to have a scientific process to justify their rules and then to comply with those rules, which I think has been a reasonable success. And then I don't want to forget, of course, the shared jurisdiction and activity, and that's in the enforcement of the FRA regulations and the PHMSA regulations. And we have inspectors in the 5 disciplines: track and structures, motive power and equipment, that's locomotives and rail cars, operating practices, that's the operating rules, that there's quite a lot of them for necessary how to operate the system, signal and train control, and of course then hazardous material shipments. We also are enforcing an emergency order that was issued in response to the Canadian tragedy, and that has to do with how the train was secured. And we've also been participating with the FRA in some blitzes on that as far as classification. And I want to note that the Federal Railroad Administration does train and certify our inspectors to implement the participation agreement. It takes about a year of, somebody can come off the railroad with 30 years of experience. It'll take another year for the federal government to certify them. And then the Rail Safety Advisory Committee has been set up for the Federal Railroad Administration in a negotiated rulemaking format with the purpose of ensuring that they can move quickly when there is a consensus on what regulations are needed. It's made up of about 50 members from the stakeholders, railroads, unions, shippers, car owners, equipment suppliers. The Association of State Rail Safety Managers has 1 seat, so the states are represented with 1 seat. That might not sound like much, but when you have to have a complete consensus, it just takes 1 vote to decline. I actually am the representative at the moment. I've made 4 trips since the Canadian tragedy back to Washington and have been negotiating with the committee. 3 work groups. They're looking at hazardous materials issues. Some of the things they're looking at is having different regulations on residue in a car. For example, residue can be as much as about 7%. So if you have a 30,000-gallon car of chlorine, you still have about 2,100 gallons of chlorine in the car. So it's not an insignificant risk. So they're going to look at that and think about revising the regulations for residue. Train securement. Obviously, the Canadian train wasn't sufficiently secured. There may have been some extenuating circumstances about what caused it to run away, but granted, it wasn't secured well enough, and it ran into the town. Some of the estimates are that it had, the engineer said he tied 11 handbrakes, and just for your own comfort level, the matrices the railroads use in this country, in the state of California, would have required about 22 handbrakes. Crew size. The Canadian train had 1 crew person. I actually worked on Western Pacific as a brakeman for about 10 years and know that to tie down a train, it's better to have 2 people, especially if you have to interact with if the brakeman has to interact with the engineer. I mean, it takes 2 people to do it ideally, to make sure that no shortcuts are taken. The FRA's view and the view of the state association is that there should be a minimum of 2. So if RSEC, it has to be a consensus or it's not passed. If there's no consensus, the FRA can use the information that it has learned about, for example, inadvertent consequences of one provision in a regulation. That's always important to know. But then it can turn around and then open a notice of proposed rulemaking and take the long way to adopt a regulation. And of course, in this regard, the PUC can provide comment and testimony. I've done that myself. And the PUC can petition the FRA for new rulemaking. I don't know of an instance of when we've done that.